now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Last week, I asked the Premier if he had reached out to women's organizations, as the member for Halifax Citadel, Sable Island, said he did last May. The Premier replied, and I quote directly from Hansard, "It is the Minister of our government who was responsible for that file, not the Premier, who would have reached out." The Premier was referring to the then Minister responsible for the status of women, Ms. Joanne Bernard. I would like to ask the Premier today, does he still stand by that statement?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it is my understanding, yes.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, in fact, Mr. Speaker, we contacted the women's centres that were referred to by the member for Halifax Citadel, Sable Island, as did reporters from the Coast magazine, and they confirm that no one, not the Premier, not his office, not the Minister, or anyone, contacted him about the matter in question, Mr. Speaker. That directly contradicts the statements made by the member for Halifax Citadel, Sable Island that day in May to Ms. Coffin, and now it contradicts the statement made by the Premier in this House on Friday. So I'd like to ask the Premier to explain the contradiction between what we are hearing from women's centres and what his Minister and what he has said in this House.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know about the conversation that my minister would have had during the election campaign. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, it was my understanding that the former minister reached out to those organizations when it came to this issue. I also want to remind the honourable member that we are the first government to put in place a sexual assault strategy across our government. We've done it in the first term. We've committed $1 million in this current budget that we're voting on, Mr. Speaker. And we're going to continue to work with organizations across this province so that everyone feels safe in the home and the workplace, Mr. Speaker, in their environment in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this is a very serious matter. I think it's fair to say all members of this House support the sexual assault strategy, the domestic assault strategy that has been brought forward by this government and others. None of those strategies, Mr. Speaker, suggest that it's okay to tell a story to a survivor of a domestic assault in the middle of an election campaign. Mr. Speaker, the Premier is now saying that, as far as he's aware, someone contacted the women's centres. We know for a fact that did not happen. Will he at least admit the obvious now? No one from his government, either himself or his office or the Minister, contacted the women's centres of this province, as was stated by the member for Halifax Citadel Island that day.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I absolutely agree with the member that every member of this House takes this issue serious, Mr. Speaker, but I want to remind the honourable member this is the only government and the only party that has actually taken the issue seriously with money, Mr. Speaker, to put in place a strategy to deal with the issue, and we're very proud of the work that we're doing with women's centres, sexual assault strategy across this province. And in this current budget, if he supports it, I hope he votes for this budget because there's money in there to continue that process.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday morning we heard that Doctors Nova Scotia is bringing forward a lawsuit against the province over an alleged breach of contract. And later in the day, we heard from the Minister of Health that, in his view, the Department of Health's work on this file has been exemplary. And in the meantime, from then until now, we've heard many questioning that opinion. So I wish to ask the Premier directly, does he in fact stand by his government's decision to take a contribution holiday from the Doctors Nova Scotia Benefits Payment Fund?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, our government has continued to work with Doctors Nova Scotia. As he knows, there are benefits that the government would pay and continue to pay, that we want to pay to ensure that physicians have health benefits, dental benefits, maternity leave, other benefits that be associated with that. Mr. Speaker, we've continued to pay for those benefits, even when there was, continued through the negotiations. Those benefits have been paid each and every day, but we do not believe it's reasonable that $4.4 million of taxpayers' money be taken from that and stashed in Doctors Nova Scotia when that money could be used, as the honourable member would know, to begin to eliminate wait lists that we have in this province. As he knows, there's money in this budget to continue to go forward. And we've said to Doctors Nova Scotia, as they continue to draw down on that money to go back into where it would be to pay the benefits that all Nova Scotians are paying for, we would continue to make sure that we paid in future dates.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier's use of the word stashed in this context gives some indication of why it is that the government has failed over and over to successfully negotiate a single major healthcare labour agreement over the last 4 years. This current debacle with Doctors Nova Scotia is but the latest in a long, sad negotiating incompetence string. So I'd like to ask the Premier, how can the people of Nova Scotia have any faith in the government's ability to deal with the healthcare crisis when their record is so very weak in the area of taking the right approach and the right attitude to negotiation?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I would agree with the honourable member. We have a different approach than he does. There's no question about that, Mr. Speaker. And Nova Scotians want a government that's going to stand up for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Every union member supports their own union. We're not here to support. What we're here to do, Mr. Speaker, is make sure the benefits that doctors across this province deserve and have come to account on, that are paid for by the taxpayers of Nova Scotia, are paid for. It's not to stand here and support Doctors Nova Scotia with an additional $4.4 million that this healthcare system requires on a daily basis.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the decision to not offer to support the doctors of Nova Scotia is one that we have lots of evidence of. The Premier has often touted doctors as an example of the government's capacity to negotiate, but people today are able to see the difference. And so I want to ask the Premier, does he not see that his government's unfortunate negotiating record has significantly worsened the healthcare crisis in the province?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to also thank him for recognizing the negotiations we have with Doctors Nova Scotia. He would also know that as part of that negotiations was a drawdown on the $4.4 million of taxpayers' money, Mr. Speaker, that is there in an account that was over and above all of the benefits that the taxpayers have paid for physicians, which they deserve, which they've negotiated, and our government has continued to pay for. Even when there wasn't a contract in place, there's never been a single day that the benefits associated that doctors deserve in this province were not paid. We paid for them. It is not unreasonable that the $4.4 million that belongs to taxpayers come back to the taxpayers so that we continue to reduce wait times, Mr. Speaker. This current budget has additional money for orthopedic surgeries, Mr. Speaker. We want to continue to do so.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it has been reported, without dispute, by the way, that the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island told Ms. Coffin that the Premier had called, and I directly quote, all the women's centres of the province, and that they were unanimous in supporting the rehiring decision that the Premier had made, Mr. Speaker. That is not true. That did not happen. We've talked to the women's centres themselves, and I can add, Mr. Speaker, that they do not appreciate being used in this way as part of a story to justify a decision that that member knew would be unpopular and cause distress to Ms. Coffin, Mr. Speaker. For the women's centres of the province, will the Premier clear this up and just admit what we all know, no one made any such calls?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank women's centres across the province who continue to work with our government to ensure that we put in place the services that are required in communities across this province. Very grateful for the work that we've been able to do, and I'm continuing to looking forward to the work that we're going to continue to do over the next 4 years.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, you know, it's clear what's going on here. We have a blatant cover-up of a deliberately misleading statement made to a woman in this province, Ms. Coffin, who asked a legitimate question, Mr. Speaker, and that's not acceptable. She deserves the truth, and women's centres deserve the truth so that people will know what really happened, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier one more time, will he take this opportunity, when we know it's so obvious what really happened, will he take this opportunity to apologize to Ms. Coffin for what she was told that day and apologize to the women's centres of this province whose name was taken in vain?
Just before we get to the Premier, I'd just like to remind the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition that the term cover-up has been ruled unparliamentary on a number of occasions in this chamber. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to work with women's centres across the province. We're going to work with second stage housing, Mr. Speaker, for women and children who are fleeing domestic violence. We're going to continue to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that we bring light to the issue that's in this province. We're going to continue to make sure that we resource with finances a strategy that will continue to help eliminate the domestic violence in this province, Mr. Speaker, and continue to create an environment where we all want. Same thing we all want for our own wives and daughters and women that we know in our lives, that they feel safe, Mr. Speaker, in their own homes, in their community, in their workplace, and we're going to continue that great work with our partners across this province.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this week, CBC interviewed Rob McDonald, a resident of Aspey Bay, who has been working to recruit more doctors to Cape Breton, particularly north of Smoky. Mr. McDonald spoke about how in his home area, soon they're going to be left with just one full-time doctor and two part-timers who are looking to retire. He spoke about his worry that the doctor shortage will prompt emergency closures in Neils Harbour, leaving residents literally hours away from emergency health care. So I'd like to ask the Premier, doesn't the prospect of having to drive 3 hours to get to an emergency room qualify in his mind as evidence of a health care crisis?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the questions. I've said many times in this House, I said over the number of months, there's no question we know there are communities across this province that there's a shortage of health care providers. We're continuing to work with our partners to ensure that we put the appropriate and right health care team together to provide primary care access to communities in communities across this province. And as he would know, the community he speaks of obviously is one of those communities, and there's others in the province. We're going to continue to work hard to ensure that we provide them with that primary care access.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, as a number of members of the House have spoken repeatedly and strongly about, doctors at the moment are leaving Cape Breton at a rate that this government simply can't keep up with. And then yesterday's announcement of the pending Doctors Nova Scotia lawsuit. So can the Premier please answer the question? Doesn't he agree that the dispute his government is engaging in with Doctors Nova Scotia is bound to have a serious negative impact on rural recruitment and physician retention?
The Honourable Premier.
No.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, as Nova Scotians are now learning, the federal Liberals are not the only ones who will gain a windfall if the proposed tax increases on our small businesses and doctors goes through. The provincial government will obviously also be a financial winner and get a tax windfall from those same changes. I'd like to ask the Premier if he knows how much money does the province expect to gain from these small business tax increases that are proposed by the federal government?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to, first of all, thank the Minister of Finance, Policy and Treasury Board, where they worked with the Federal Minister of Finance when he was in town. I also had the opportunity to meet with him as well. I just got back from Ottawa, where I met with the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, and fellow premiers. Very grateful to hear the Federal Finance Minister recognizing that the proposed legislation would have to change. He recognizes the transition of family farms and family businesses needs to be transitioned from generation to generation. Recognize the challenge women in the workforce being able to save for maternity leave. And Mr. Speaker, you recognize that every Nova Scotian and every Canadian needs the capacity to be able to save for retirement. And I'm looking forward, quite frankly, to seeing the final piece of legislation when it comes forward.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I believe what the federal finance minister said is he's going to tinker with the proposed tax changes. And I want to be clear, this is a massive tax increase on our small businesses, the biggest one in 50 years. It's a massive tax increase for the doctors of Nova Scotia. We're already struggling to get more doctors to the people that need them. Tinkering, I guess, the Premier thinks we should be happy that there might be some tinkering with it. But we're not happy, Mr. Speaker, with tinkering when the devastation to our economy and our healthcare system is so clear. Mr. Speaker, but Nova Scotians would be comforted to know that the Premier does not want any part in the proceeds from those tax increases. So I will ask him to clear that up. Will he commit to refunding the taxes, the extra taxes that will be paid by Nova Scotia businesses, the provincial portion at least, back to those taxpayers when these tax changes go through?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Again, I want to tell him the Federal Finance Minister very clearly identified changes that would be coming forward. As he said today, there would be changes to the piece of legislation before it comes forward. I want to thank all those Nova Scotians and Canadians who came forward, and I want to remind the honourable member, regardless of what the federal government does, because we believe, Mr. Speaker, that the changes that we've outlined, that physicians should be able to save for retirement, physicians should be able to save for maternity leave. We believe small business owners should be able to keep capital in to reinvest. And I also want to remind them, without those changes, Mr. Speaker, this government has given the largest single tax cut to Nova Scotians in our history, Mr. Speaker, and at the same time, Mr. Speaker, we're giving the small business community in this province tax relief, Mr. Speaker, to reinvest in their communities.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. Today in public accounts we learned that the Auditor General has long held concerns about the internal control weaknesses at the IWK and the Nova Scotia Health Authority. In fact, the Auditor General was so concerned about the control weaknesses that he had to modify his audit strategy for the year ended March 31st. The audit took place in the summer. These weaknesses were known to the Auditor General. They were known to the management. Presumably they were at least known to probably the former health minister. The Auditor General stated that he had reached out to the current health minister to discuss the internal controls, but that meeting didn't take place until after the IWK spending story broke in the media. I'd like to ask the minister, can the minister please tell us when the House, when he knew and from whom he first heard about the spending issues at the IWK?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Speaker, appreciate the question from the member. I would have to go back and look at my calendar to see exactly when I would have received a specific briefing note. I'd hate to provide incorrect information, but indeed, by my recollection, it would have been right around the time the story broke. I think that was, if memory serves, back in June or early July, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the management knew about the internal control weaknesses and the two ministers, I guess, knew about the internal control weaknesses, why did we have to wait to read about the IWK situation in the paper before the new minister reached out to the Auditor General to talk about the weaknesses and controls? These are things that should have been top of mind straight away, should have been some sense of urgency to address these weaknesses. Instead, they carried on year after year after year. I'd like to ask the minister, why wait? Why not get involved in trying to get these weaknesses cleared up before we have the unfortunate situation that has occurred at the IWK?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member. I think it's important to recognize that the work of the Auditor General and his team that they provide when they assess the performance and the operations of not just our health authorities, but government agencies, the government itself, that they do look for opportunities for improvement. That's what these recommendations are, Mr. Speaker, the recommendations to improve the controls within these organizations. It's an important part of the work of the Auditor General in his office, and I believe it's quite clear that we're going to be moving forward on those recommendations within the health authorities. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Agriculture. On September 28th, during estimates in the Red Room, I asked the Minister about vacancies on the Nova Scotia Crop and Livestock Insurance Commission since October 2015. The Minister told me there were 2 vacancies, and I will table that exchange from estimates. According to the Auditor General's report today, I was not the only one worried. The vacancies on the Commission put the Commission at risk of not being able to fulfill its mandate with another position due up at the end of this year. I personally know of at least one person who applied to be on that Commission. My question for the Minister is, when will the Minister of Agriculture take his responsibility serious enough to make these vital appointments made for the agriculture industry?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I indeed do take the very responsible very seriously. Unfortunately, we have a very difficult time finding qualified people to sit on these boards. We've advertised, we've re-advertised, and people don't come forward.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know at least one qualified person who applied, and I'd be happy to share that personally with the Minister. He then went on to blame the process as being slow and cumbersome. and finally stated that it took 4 or 5 weeks to get things on the Cabinet agenda. My question for the Minister is this. Can the Minister tell this House if he has been able to get any of his appointments on the Cabinet agenda since election, or has the Cabinet just not sat enough for him to get his agenda items on?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Definitely the Cabinet sits enough, and it's, you know, it's important.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
It's important that there's a process behind this, a long, complicated process, mostly through the bureaucracy, and until the bureaucracy changes, which I can't see it happening because of all the rules around appointments to boards, has been well structured over years because of abuse of that in the past. It will take that long and longer sometimes to get it done.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our province has the single highest rate of child poverty anywhere in Canada. Last year, our province had the fastest rising rate of food bank use anywhere in the entire country. In a letter just recently to the Cape Breton Post and then again today in the Chronicle Herald, Mr. Nick Jennery, who is the Executive Director of Feed Nova Scotia, said that he was deeply disappointed by the recent budget's failure to, in his words, significantly address this crisis. Mr. Speaker, I wish to ask the Premier, does the Premier agree with Nick Jennery that when it comes to poverty and food insecurity, Nova Scotia is in a crisis?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I believe it was a member of the former Conservative caucus that was here. I think it might have been the member from Inverness, along with the Minister of Agriculture, who brought forward a bill that was ensuring that farmers could have access to provide food into the food banks across the province. That was a wonderful gesture by the entire House, which passed that piece of legislation. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we know there are challenges being faced by those who are on income assistance. That's why we're working very hard under the leadership of the Minister to transform income assistance, one that, Mr. Speaker, helps people get to work. It's why we're investing in the breakfast programs across our province, and it's why, Mr. Speaker, when we had an opportunity to cut taxes, it was directed to low-income Nova Scotians, and I hope the Honourable Member will recognize the good spirit behind that gesture and behind that piece of public policy, and will vote for the budget that's before him.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, it is not a question of spirit. It is a question of the actual financial capacity for a person to be able to buy their groceries. And so I ask the government to consider these two facts. Fact one, 1 in 6 people who in Nova Scotia lines up at a food bank is a person who is currently or has very recently been employed. And fact two, and members of the government may wish to just take a moment to register their shame about this. Fact two, on October 1st, 3 days ago, Nova Scotia became the province with the lowest minimum wage in Canada. And so I want to ask the Premier, Mr. Speaker, when can the people of Nova Scotia, like those in BC and Ontario and Alberta, expect to have a minimum wage of $15?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I thought the Honourable Member and I had this debate a few months ago, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is the budget that's before him increases the basic personal exemption for low-income Nova Scotians by $3,000, which will leave more money in their pockets, give them more buying power, Mr. Speaker. And if the Honourable Member had the kind of energy he just showed when he was in opposition, he might have prevented his government from raising power rates by 35% and driving families into energy poverty, Mr. Speaker. We finally got to a place where stabilizing the costs that households across this province have, and we're going to continue to work with families, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that they can afford the basic necessities, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. As we know today in public accounts, the Auditor General expressed significant concerns over the internal controls at a few organizations inside the government. His use of the word significant is in itself significant. It's very important, Mr. Speaker. I know the Minister of Finance just referred to the Auditor General's observations as opportunities for improvement. They're much more than that, Mr. Speaker. And we know that the Auditor General has cited year-over-year deficiencies in the internal controls at Housing Nova Scotia. These internal controls speak to poor monitoring and insufficient rigor around journal entries. It's been known for years. My question for the minister is, can the minister explain why Housing Nova Scotia continues to have these internal control
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to assure the honourable member and the Auditor General that we take his recommendations seriously. We're in the process of implementing his recommendations, and they will be complete by December of this year. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you. Thank the minister for the response. And these are year-over-year deficiencies. They shouldn't have been there to begin with, and yet they stayed year after year after year. And now there's something that's happened. Something that's happened that spurred some activity, Mr. Speaker. I wonder what that might have been. Might it have been something happened at the IWK to get people to spring into action? The people of Nova Scotia deserve better. If these controls can be fixed by December, why did we wait year after year after year? That's my question for the minister.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the honourable member would understand that I have been the minister since, what, June? May, June, Mr. Speaker. I can assure the honourable member there's a project underway to identify the security levels. That's underway. And it will be complete very soon. We are also hiring a person who will oversee the people who make the journal entries. So I want to assure the honourable member that this is being taken care of. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you. Thank the minister for the response, and maybe she can give the Minister of Health some advice on how to clear up the internal control deficiencies. My question is for the Minister of Education. Yesterday, Nova Scotians were given 29 hours notice to make their way to Province House and discuss an important piece of legislation, give their thoughts on something. And for interested Nova Scotians, especially those who live outside of the HRM, the short notice makes it impossible for them to make appropriate arrangements to travel to Halifax and have their say on something they should be entitled to have their say on. And in the case of the specific bill, parents of young children and parents with young children, the problem is exasperated. Mr. Speaker, my question for the minister is, will the minister commit to extending the time that Bill 8 is before the committee so that all parents of all children in all areas of the province have an opportunity to speak to the bill?
Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I mean, we do have to recognize the geographical accessibility issue that having law amendments on site here does create for Nova Scotians. That is a legitimate challenge for every government who sits on this side of the House. Simply because of the location of this building and where it's at. So that said, we also do allow Nova Scotians to reach out through email, letters, phone calls, and any means of communication possible so that they can voice their opinion on these important pieces of legislation that we bring forward to the House. And of course, their voices are also represented here in this chamber, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the minister. We do acknowledge that for the disabilities legislation that was before this House, there was some changes made, extended the consultation time, and pre-primary education is an issue that will have long-lasting effects on this education system, on the children, and the system itself. So those people that are impacted by it should have the opportunity to speak to it. Mr. Speaker, I just don't think 29 hours is sufficient notice. There should be something more. So I'd ask the minister again, will the minister commit to extending law amendments for perhaps an extra day at least, so that people have an opportunity to come and have their say should they choose to?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. A couple of thoughts on that. We know Nova Scotians support this piece of legislation because they voted for it in the last election when they returned us to a majority government, Mr. Speaker. We are on the verge of having an extensive consultation with the sector, with parents.
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are on the verge of extending a major consultation with the sector, with parents, to discuss the further phases of this particular program, Mr. Speaker. I actually wonder if the member opposite talked to parents who would benefit from a free pre-primary service before he actually committed to getting rid of it if he was the Minister of Education. I'd like to know where he got his information from.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
So no then, eh? So no, eh?
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. In the Nova Scotia's Life Flight helicopter was banned from landing on our hospital's rooftops of last year in April due to federal regulations. An interim measure was put in place to land at Point Pleasant Park. We were told that the helipad would be able to be used by August 1st. That hasn't happened. August 1st has come and went. We all know the people that need Life Flight are in critical condition. And 15 to 30 minutes, Mr. Speaker, can be a matter of between life and death. So my question to the Minister of Health is, why did the government miss their targets on resuming the landings by August 1st?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate this important question from the member. Indeed, as August approached, I did address this with the media for the public, that what transpired was there's an opportunity to secure enhancements, improvements in the cabin of the Life Flight helicopters. These were recommended improvements to benefit the healthcare professionals, the patient, and the crew members on these helicopters. It was enhancements that were being made at no cost to the taxpayers of Nova Scotia. The impact, of course, was a delay. Those helicopters arrived in the province just a week or so ago, and now the training and so on will be taking place here in the province to get those helicopters up and running as soon as possible, ideally within about the next month.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A quick Google search shows us that this service, unfortunately, is very important to the people of Nova Scotia. And as we see specialists leave across this province, it's even more important. The people from Cape Breton and the people from Yarmouth and Amherst need to have a service that is reliable, and 15 to 30 minutes is an important period of time. I'd like to table these documents that show a number of people that, and unfortunately, sometimes have not resulted in good outcomes. So will the Minister of Health today give us an actual date when we can expect this service to be back in place?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member's question and the preamble. There's an important community that the member missed, and that's Anna-Kanish. I want to assure the member that I had a constituent who had two occasions their child this summer required Life Flight services. That individual spoke to me this summer to advise how fantastic the service was despite the current structure and setup, but the service of our emergency professionals as well as the services provided by the frontline healthcare professionals at the IWK, the service I want to assure her and all members of this legislature and indeed all of the public, Mr. Speaker, that the services and the emergency services are continuing to provide for Nova Scotians are top notch. The other important thing is, Mr. Speaker, we're replacing one Life Flight helicopter with two to ensure that we enhance those emergency services for all Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say it's been interesting and rather frustrating for the women of the NDP caucus to sit here listening quietly this week as the Premier and Leader of the Opposition, both men, argued back and forth on the issue of women's sexual health and safety. Last year, this government assured Nova Scotians that our universities would implement standalone sexual assault policies to combat gender-based violence on campus. But according to a report released yesterday by the Canadian Federation of Students, half of our post-secondary institutions do not meet the government's requirement to maintain these policies. So, my question today is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Does he believe that this situation is acceptable? And if not, what does he plan to do about it?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had the chance yesterday to meet with student organizations from across the province. One of them was CFS, who the report that the member tabled, CFS presented me with a report. And in the report, they have found that 5 universities do not have standalone sexual assault strategies. Mr. Speaker, in my view, this is unacceptable. I have asked the department to reach out to the universities and if in fact they don't have standalone sexual assault strategies, to make sure that they put them in place. The current MOU does have a section where they have to have standalone sexual assault strategies. I've also indicated to the department that in the upcoming MOU next year, which we're negotiating now, if universities do not have a standalone sexual assault strategy, we will hold back their 1% increases. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the response. Mr. Speaker, for the past several years, the NDP caucus has been working to ensure adequate institutional responses to sexualized violence on campus. We've tabled legislation time and time again because we believe that these policies should not be optional. However, rather than use their legislative authority to hold our public institutions to account, the government insisted that a clause buried in the Memorandum of Understanding would be enough to guarantee the safety and well-being of our students. So my question, Mr. Speaker, it has been a year since the MOU was signed, and still half of the universities are without these crucial policies. So given that the MOU doesn't seem to be an adequate incentive, and you're saying that you would take away 1% from these universities, can the minister explain what the consequences will be for those schools that have failed to implement the policies already?
The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, the MOU that's in place right now was signed back in 2008. What I do want to point out, in terms of universities not following a sexual assault strategy, it's very important that they do, and that's something that is important to all Nova Scotians. Every Nova Scotian going to university or working at a university or anywhere in the public needs to feel safe in their institutions. The 1% holdback would be quite significant to universities, as it would be over $3 million. I can assure the member, one of the conversations I had yesterday with student organizations from across the province was, if the 1% holdback is not effective in terms of having a proper sexual assault strategy on every campus in the province, then I would lobby my government to bring legislation forward as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, in accordance with the administrative directive issued under Section 14A of the Public Service Act, Perennia Food and Agriculture Incorporated is required to disclose travel and hospitality expenses of senior management. According to the Perennia website, the expenses of former CEO Joanne Fewer are shown as a total amount per quarter with no explanations, and I'll table that. Can the Minister please explain why he has not required Perennia to fully disclose the travel and hospitality expenses of the former CEO?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
I'm not aware that that hasn't been done, and I will investigate.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, interim Chief Executive Officer Lynn Godlin has continued with the same practice as her predecessor. However, that is better than her counterparts at the Nova Scotia Farm Loan Board and the Nova Scotia Fisheries and Aquaculture Board, who the Auditor General rightly pointed out do not publish reports at all. While the expenses for travel do not seem extravagant, they are far from transparent, and we are left to wonder what the taxpayer paid money for. Can the Minister please reassure us that his department is monitoring the expenses of the heads of the Crown corporations under his responsibility, and require that the details be posted going forward?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much for that question. It's a very important question, actually. At the time the Auditor General did the audit on the department, the financial reporting on the expenses wasn't in place. It's on the website now and will be from now on a regular basis.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, last week I asked a question about 11 nursing positions in the emergency room at the Cape Breton Regional Hospital that were unfilled. We were told the 11 positions were taken from the outlying hospitals during the summer closures to fill that void. To date, to my knowledge, these positions have not been returned to their local hospitals. So my question is to the Minister, will the Minister admit the practice of moving emergency room nurses to the Cape Breton Regional Hospital from our rural hospitals is preventing communities from receiving emergency care at home where they deserve it?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. When the decisions around the staff assignments within our healthcare system, of course, the work that gets done is to ensure the best healthcare services for people in a region, Mr. Speaker. That's the work and the focus to make sure that service is available. We do have, and I assure the member opposite and all members, when we continue the recruitment efforts to bring healthcare providers providers, be they physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, family practice nurses, other care providers, Mr. Speaker, to the communities. Those recruitment efforts continue and are ongoing.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, with respect to emergency room closures, we're told that some of them are due to the lack of doctors and others are due to a lack of nursing staff. These staff are being moved to the Cape Breton Regional Hospital and not able to serve their home hospitals. Will the minister admit that this practice is to starve out emergency room services in rural areas, and will he commit to restoring emergency services at hospitals like Northside General, Waterford and Glace Bay?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. I certainly do, Mr. Speaker, assure the member opposite that every effort when it comes to recruiting, as I said, our healthcare providers, be they physicians, be they nurses of any variety, nurse practitioners, family practice nurses, that those efforts are ongoing. As part of my tour of the province, I met with nursing students at St. Evacs, at CBU, and the Dal campus in Yarmouth, Mr. Speaker, to talk about those students and their graduation, to talk about where they and where they want to practice and provide their services, how excited they are at the prospects of staying here in Nova Scotia to provide those services in our communities. We are waiting, and we do hire most of those nurses, or certainly those nurses that want to stay and work here in Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct my question to the Minister for the Emergency Management Office. On behalf of residents of Framboise and Forchoux, have been struggling with inconsistent landline coverage and service for years. In Framboise, residents did not have phone service for over a month, and for months before that, the phone lines would cut out or be full of static, making them essentially unusable. Imagine not having any phone service for over a month. The calls would be dropped, static on lines, or the lines being dead for hours and sometimes days. These rural communities are home to a high percentage of seniors who need to be able to dial 911. In fact, that's their right through CRTC. I'd like to ask the Minister, Mr. Speaker, why there were no actions taken to assist these residents in their time of crisis.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question and the correspondence that I received this morning. That is true. The CRTC does control regulations over phone companies, but EMO is always concerned when we hear situations like this. Upon seeing the initial media in the Cape Breton Post, I asked EMO to reach out to the Emergency Management Coordinator in Richmond County. The counties are really the first line of defence when it comes to situations like this, and EMO plays an active role in it. We are monitoring the situation, and I offered to the member to sit down with our EMO officials to ensure that we address the concerns coming from your residents.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, while some of the residents have actually seen some recent improvements, they continue not to have a secondary source of communication. So there's no cell phone service in this area either. And they've been fighting for a cellular tower for years, but have had no luck. When their landlines go down, and in the wintertime I can tell you it's even more of a problem, they don't have a secondary means of communication. So I would like to ask the minister if he would be willing to commit to securing the approvals and perhaps some provincial funding necessary to assist these residents in getting cell phone tower coverage finally in that area.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for the question again. Of course, we always try to build strong relationships, EMO does, with communities across Nova Scotia, and working with our emergency management coordinators. This was, in any situation like this, it's the first line of defense is with the communities, and they reach out to us to activate any kind of support. We're always engaged in those conversations with communities, and I would be more than willing and interested to sit down with the member and with the EMO staff to talk about our concerns further.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I again asked the Minister of Natural Resources about plans for a clear cut inside the sanctuary in the Toby Attic. While on Friday she said that she believed I was mistaken, I believe yesterday when time ran out she was about to confirm the proposed harvest. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Minister has also told this House that she has final eyes on every cut that is happening in the province, and I can table the Hansard record. So I asked the Minister, will she commit to ensuring that no clear cutting happens inside the sanctuary?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the honourable member for that question once again. It's certainly been repetitive in this House. We had a discussion after the House session, or after our question period yesterday, where I outlined to her the procedure for actually determining what forest practices would take place in specific areas, and offered her also previously the ability to come to the office, as I'm going to offer all members of the House, to see exactly what takes place, how it's determined, how different forestry harvesting methods are determined in all practices. That said, as the member has alluded, I will be eventually getting the report that will show me all the scientific data behind any determination that's made. I haven't seen that yet, and no decision has been made at this point.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, as time goes by, there are fewer and fewer habitats in the province where wildlife can live undisturbed, and one would think that a game sanctuary would provide this type of undisturbed setting. However, we also hear that Crown lands inside the Liscombe Game Sanctuary, which is home to the endangered mainland moose, continue to be heavily clear-cut. So I'd like to ask the minister, does she have any concerns about clear-cutting happening inside the Liscombe Game Sanctuary?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that first comment actually really threw me for a little bit of a loop, because the notes here I have show me when you talk about areas available for wildlife, we have the Ketchimakuchi National Park, the Tobiatic Wilderness Area, with 464 acres. That's almost 10% of all the land base in the province. Now, we're talking about Liscombe Game Sanctuary, and game sanctuaries are not exempt from harvesting, but we do use sound harvesting processes to determine whether harvesting will be done in the area.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. During the months of July and August, there were approximately 80 hours of emergency department closures for the Roseway Hospital in Shelburne. These closures were due to physician unavailability. On August 29th, the spokesman for the Nova Scotia Health Authority attributed these closures to it being the summer months. Fast forward from that day to 1 month and a day later, on September 30th, this past weekend, the emergency department at Roseway was closed yet again between the hours of 6 p.m. on Saturday and 8 p.m. on Sunday. My question to the minister is, can you please tell me why these closures are still happening and what your department is doing to keep the Roseway Emergency Department open?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. As I've believe mentioned to the member previously, I had the opportunity to visit that site and the medical staff and tour the site previously. One of the things that really I took away hearing about the concerns with the closures and about physicians in the emergency room was to learn that, in fact, in the community they actually have more physicians than they've had really in decades. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, part of the challenge is the way the physicians choose to practice, that there are fewer physicians interested or willing to take on the practice in the emergency room. The way that we serve these community emergency rooms in cases like that, like at Roseway, is through locum, temporary allocation of physicians. So that's the approach that's being taken right now in that community.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday, September 22nd at around 11 in the morning, a woman was hit by a vehicle in downtown Shelburne. She was transported to Yarmouth Regional Hospital over an hour away from Shelburne because Roseway Emergency Department was closed yet again. Is the Minister of Health able to tell the constituents of Shelburne why they should have to travel over an hour to access emergency health services?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia has a top-notch emergency response system in the province of Nova Scotia that serves all of our communities, Mr. Speaker. That service is really, in many cases, an envy of our sister jurisdictions, provinces and territories across the country, Mr. Speaker. When they respond to an emergency situation at like the member referred at a car accident or any type of emergency situation, individuals are receiving excellent care and service and support as they get them to a more permanent location in a hospital emergency room to respond to the situation. Thank you.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Environment. Carter's Beach is both historically and culturally valuable in my constituency. Over the last year, the inaction of this government has put the ecosystem of the area at risk. There have been rumors for years that the area will be protected and a plan put in place to preserve this sensitive area for future generations. My question is, can the Minister of Environment please tell me the current preservation status of Carter's Beach and what his department plans to do before next summer to help this sensitive area?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member opposite for the question. There's always a balance of considerations when we're looking at protecting land. This is in the pending status area. The officials from the Department of Environment had engaged the community, the broad community, in an event, in a community meeting to see what we could do to find solutions in terms of the human impacts of the area. So it is a common place for people to go and enjoy the area there. There's been some challenges in terms of setting up the appropriate infrastructure. So as of yet, we have to compile the information we've got from the community and move forward with a balanced approach. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Queen Shelburne.
Thank you.
Order, please. Time allotted for the members' questions put to ministers has expired.